When a Hollywood legend steps onto a late-night stage, sparks are expected. But no one could have anticipated what happened between Robert Downey Jr. and Stephen Colbert on that fateful night. What began as a casual interview quickly spiraled into something far more personal, far more volatile, and far more revealing than anyone in the audience, or watching at home, was ready for. Stay with us as we break down the full confrontation, moment by moment, and expose what really caused one of the most dramatic walkouts in recent television history. Make sure to like and subscribe to catch more stories just like this one. The set of The Late Show with Stephen Colbert was brimming with excitement as the audience anticipated the arrival of one of Hollywood's most iconic figures, Robert Downey Jr. Known for his sharp wit and charm, Downey was the guest everyone was talking about that night. But little did anyone know, this appearance would be anything but ordinary. As the cameras rolled and the familiar theme music faded, Colbert, with his usual playful smile, introduced his guest. "Ladies and gentlemen, the man who brought irons, man to life, Robert Downey Jr." The crowd erupted into applause, and Downey walked onto the stage with a calm demeanor, flashing a smile, acknowledging the crowd with a nod. But his eyes, they weren't the sparkling ones that fans were used to seeing. Colbert wasted no time, diving right into the conversation. "Robert, it's great to have you here. Now, I've got to ask, you've done just about everything in Hollywood, from Iron Man to Sherlock Holmes. What's next for you? Are you finally taking a break?" Colbert's tone was light, casual, but there was a glimmer of curiosity in his voice. He was known for his jokes, but tonight he had a sharp edge to him that wasn't lost on Downey. "I don't think I'll ever take a break," Downey replied, his voice steady but his eyes narrowing just slightly. "Not until I find something that really excites me." It was an answer that felt rehearsed, as if Downey was used to these questions. But Colbert wasn't letting him off easy. "Really?" Colbert leaned forward, his smile never faltering. "Because, after all these years, what more could possibly excite you? Isn't it hard to find something that matches the thrill of Iron Man? Or maybe you're just bored now?" His words were light, but the challenge was clear. A tense silence followed. The studio audience seemed to sense the change in the air. Downey's face hardened slightly, and for the first time that night, his usual charisma seemed to fade into something else. He leaned forward, matching Colbert's posture. "Bored? Is that what you think?" His tone was calm, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper, something simmering just beneath the surface. Colbert, sensing the shift, pushed on. "Come on, Robert. You've played one of the biggest heroes of all time. Are you telling me you're still excited by the idea of playing a billionaire genius? Or is that just something you're pretending to enjoy?" The words hung in the air, like a challenge, and the audience went silent. The playful banter was gone. Downey stared at Colbert, his eyes narrowing. "I don't pretend to enjoy anything, and I don't appreciate you reducing the work I've done to something as trivial as your attempt at humor." There was a bite to his words now, something sharp that even Colbert wasn't prepared for. Colbert, ever the professional, tried to recover, his smile returning, but there was a tension now that neither of them could ignore. "I just thought it was funny," he said with a half-laugh. But the damage was done. Robert Downey Jr. wasn't laughing. The room felt colder. The audience, once engaged, was now unsure of how to react. Was this a bit? A joke? Or had Colbert crossed a line? Downey shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. "You don't get to question my passion. You don't get to mock my work," he snapped, the calmness in his voice replaced by a palpable anger. "I've spent decades building something meaningful, something bigger than your jokes. And if you think you can trivialize that, then maybe I've got nothing left to say to you." Colbert, sensing the escalating tension, opened his mouth to speak, but Downey stood up suddenly, his chair scraping across the floor. "You know what? This isn't worth it," Downey muttered under his breath, before turning and heading for the exit. The audience was stunned into silence. Colbert looked momentarily flustered, but tried to salvage the situation with a light-hearted, "Well, folks, I guess that's all we have time for tonight." But no one in the audience was laughing. Robert Downey Jr. had just walked off Stephen Colbert's show, leaving the host, the audience, and viewers at home stunned by the explosive confrontation. As the sound of Robert Downey Jr.'s footsteps echoed through the backstage area, the tension on the set of The Late Show reached its peak. Colbert stood frozen for a moment, his usual quick-witted persona faltering as the gravity of the situation sunk in. The crew scrambled, but there was nothing they could do to undo what had just happened. Downey had never been one to shy away from confrontation, but this was different. No one had ever seen him walk off a late-night talk show, especially not in the middle of an interview. And as the cameras cut to a commercial break, the studio felt almost eerily quiet, as if time itself had paused in disbelief. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere was chaotic. The producers were in a frenzy, calling and texting, trying to figure out how to salvage the interview that had just spiraled out of control. Colbert was already in a back-and-forth with his team, apologizing profusely, though he knew deep down that no amount of scripted apologies would fix what had just gone down. Meanwhile, Downey was pacing in the green room, his mind racing. He could feel the sting of Colbert's words, the mockery, the dismissal of everything he had worked for. This wasn't just about a joke gone wrong. It was a deep, personal insult. As someone who had spent years building his career and his legacy, Downey wasn't going to stand by and let it be belittled, especially not on national television. In the green room, Downey sat down, his hands clasped tightly together as he tried to steady himself. His phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket, but he ignored it. There was only one thing on his mind. How could he turn this around? How could he make Colbert and the world understand that what had just happened was more than a misunderstanding? It was a line that had been crossed. Just as he was about to stand up and head for the exit, his manager walked into the room. "Robert, we need to talk. The press is already buzzing." "You've got to make a statement," his manager said, urgency in his voice. Downey didn't respond immediately, his mind still reeling from the interaction that had just transpired. "I don't need to make a statement," Downey finally muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. "I'm not here to play games. He's not going to make me the punchline of his show." His words were sharp, but there was an underlying sense of disappointment. He had trusted Colbert, or at least he had expected more from him. As the minutes passed, it became clear that Downey wasn't going to return to the set. The producers continued to plead with him through his manager, but the actor remained resolute. There would be no going back. Back on the stage, Colbert sat at his desk, trying to regain his composure. The cameras were back on, but the show felt like it was in free fall. "Well, ladies and gentlemen," Colbert said, attempting to laugh it off, "I guess Robert Downey Jr. is off to save the world in his own way, huh? He's got to suit up after all." The audience awkwardly chuckled, but the laughter felt hollow, forced. Colbert knew that this wasn't just a funny moment. This was a full-blown PR disaster, and the fallout had only just begun. As the show went on, social media exploded with speculation. News outlets were already sharing clips of the walk-off, and the hashtags Downey's Colbert and Walkout began trending worldwide. Fans of Downey were split. Some felt that Colbert had crossed a line, while others believed Downey had overreacted. But the general consensus was clear. This wasn't a typical celebrity spat. This was a moment that would live on in late-night television history. Meanwhile, Downey sat in the back of the car, heading back to his hotel, the silence in the vehicle almost deafening. His thoughts were clouded, but one thing was certain: he had made his point. It wasn't just about the joke anymore. It was about respect, about standing up for himself, his career, and the work that had defined his life. As he gazed out the window, his phone buzzed again. This time, he answered it. "It's me," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "I'll make the statement, but I'm doing it on my terms." As the day turned into evening, the news about Robert Downey Jr.'s walkout spread like wildfire. It wasn't just the usual Hollywood gossip. This was a confrontation that had ignited a storm. The media was already buzzing with conflicting opinions, and people across the globe were divided on who was right. But for Downey, there was a more immediate concern: how to handle the fallout. He sat in the plush hotel room, staring at the flashing notifications on his phone. Messages from fans flooded in, some offering their support, others expressing confusion, and a few questioning his actions. What bothered him the most, however, were the countless reports from journalists attempting to dissect the moment. Each headline seemed to further twist the narrative, turning it into a spectacle rather than an exchange of ideas. But Downey was no stranger to being in the public eye, and he knew how to navigate the chaos. His PR team had already set up a meeting for him to issue a statement, but he wasn't interested in following a script. This time, he would speak from the heart. "Robert, you're not just representing yourself anymore," his manager had warned earlier. "You've got a brand to protect, and the last thing you need right now is for people to think you're temperamental." Downey wasn't interested in the brand. This wasn't about keeping up appearances. This was about making sure that people understood the context of what had happened. What Colbert had done wasn't just a harmless joke. It was a personal insult. Downey had been ridiculed on a show that millions of people watched, and now it was time to take control of the narrative. The next morning, Downey stood before a camera, looking composed yet fierce. He wasn't going to let Colbert or anyone else diminish his reputation. His face was serious, but there was no sign of anger, just the determination that had always defined him. "I don't regret walking off," Downey began, his voice steady, yet laced with the emotion that had been simmering inside him for the past 24 hours. "What I do regret is allowing myself to be in a situation where I felt forced to react in the way I did. But sometimes when you're pushed too far, you have to take a stand. It's not about being temperamental. It's about being treated with respect." Downey paused, collecting his thoughts. "We live in a world where jokes are often at the expense of others, and people think that because they have a platform, they can say whatever they want. But there are lines. I don't care how big the show is, or how many viewers tune in. You can't cross certain boundaries." He leaned in slightly, emphasizing his next words. "I've been in this industry long enough to know the difference between playful banter and something that cuts deep. I've been through a lot: addiction, rehabilitation, personal struggles, and I've worked hard to build the career I have today. And that's not something I take lightly." The camera zoomed in as Downey's gaze sharpened, his resolve clear. "I've been a part of Hollywood long enough to know that sometimes the real story is not what's being said, but what's being ignored. And what happened yesterday, what happened on that stage, wasn't just a joke. It was an attack on everything I've worked for, and no one should be expected to sit there and take it." There was a brief silence before Downey continued, his voice more intense now. "I don't expect anyone to agree with me, but I do expect people to understand where I'm coming from. I'm not the type of person who shies away from tough conversations, but when you cross the line, don't be surprised when I stand up for myself." As he finished speaking, Downey gave a small nod, signaling that his statement was over. It wasn't a flashy theatrical moment. It was simply the truth, delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove to anyone. He knew the impact of his words would be felt for a long time, but in that moment, he felt a sense of peace. He had taken control of the narrative. The response to his statement was immediate. Fans flooded social media, offering both praise and criticism, but the tide was starting to turn. People who had initially sided with Colbert were beginning to question the comedian's approach, and Downey's supporters rallied behind him, praising his boldness and his refusal to be mocked. It wasn't about celebrity feuds. It was about standing up for oneself, even in the face of public scrutiny. Meanwhile, Colbert, who had initially attempted to downplay the incident, was beginning to feel the weight of the situation. The public's perception of him had shifted, and while his team was advising him to keep things lighthearted, the pressure was mounting. This wasn't just a case of a star storming off a late-night talk show. This was about respect, and the world was watching. As the day wore on, the tension between the two sides continued to escalate, but Downey remained calm. He had made his point, and now it was up to the world to decide whether or not they understood it. The days that followed were filled with a mixture of suspense and anticipation. Robert Downey Jr.'s walkout had set the stage for something much bigger than a late-night talk show clash. It had ignited a conversation that no one could have anticipated, and the ripple effects were felt far beyond the entertainment industry. Fans, pundits, and celebrities alike began to weigh in, some offering their support for Downey's actions, while others criticized him for not taking the high road. On the other hand, Stephen Colbert's team had tried to keep the situation under control. Initially, they had downplayed the incident, claiming it was just part of the comedy. But as the public backlash continued to grow, Colbert found himself in an uncomfortable position. Despite his usual charm, the comedian couldn't hide the frustration that was mounting behind the scenes. His show's ratings had soared since the incident, but it came at a cost. The focus had shifted from his comedic talent to a personal confrontation that many felt had crossed a line. Late one night, Colbert sat in his dressing room scrolling through Twitter. The comments were endless, each one either defending or attacking him, but there was one tweet that caught his eye. A message from a fellow comedian, someone he respected deeply. "I've seen you make people laugh, but last night, that wasn't it. Do better, Colbert." The word stung more than he cared to admit. He had always prided himself on his ability to push boundaries while still respecting his guests, but this incident had exposed a flaw in his approach. In an industry built on pushing limits, it was easy to forget where those limits actually lay. As Colbert sat there deep in thought, his team knocked on the door. "We've got to respond," one of them said. "The story isn't going away. People want answers." Colbert nodded, still lost in thought. "I know, but I don't know if I can do the same old, same old. It doesn't feel right anymore." It wasn't just about damage control. It wasn't about regaining his audience's favor. For the first time in a long while, Colbert was questioning the true cost of his humor. The incident with Downey had forced him to reckon with something deeper: his role in the culture of celebrity, and the price people paid for fame. Meanwhile, Downey was still receiving overwhelming support, but there was a sense that the confrontation wasn't over yet. People had praised his decision to stand up for himself, but as the dust began to settle, a new wave of curiosity started to build. Was this truly just about a clash between two personalities, or was there something more at play? In a private conversation with his close friend, Downey spoke about his emotions, which he had rarely shown to the public. "I've been in this industry long enough to know that the line between being real and being fake is thin," he said. "And I crossed it last night, but I had to. Sometimes you just have to say enough is enough." His friend nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "But are you prepared for the fallout? The media's not going to let this go." Downey sighed, running his hand through his hair. "I know, but I've spent so many years just trying to make people happy, trying to be the funny guy, the lovable character. At some point, you stop being yourself and start becoming who everyone else wants you to be. I'm done with that. If people can't accept me for who I am, then that's their problem, not mine." The realization had hit him like a ton of bricks. The public's expectation of him had shaped his career, but it had also shaped his identity. He had let people push him around in more ways than one, and that walkout had been the turning point. It wasn't just about proving a point on a late-night show. It was about asserting his autonomy in a world that constantly tried to define him. Back at the studio, Colbert had been given the green light to address the situation. He was prepared for a light-hearted segment, one that would allow him to joke about the situation. But as the show's writers pitched ideas, Colbert's frustration bubbled up again. He had always prided himself on his ability to make light of even the most serious issues, but this wasn't a laughing matter. This wasn't just another celebrity feud. This was about power dynamics, personal respect, and the cost of fame. He couldn't ignore it any longer, and neither could Downey. The day of Colbert's response arrived. On stage, he began with his usual wit, but there was an edge to his delivery that hadn't been there before. "Well, folks, as you know, last night's show didn't go quite as planned," Colbert said, forcing a chuckle. "We had a little technical difficulty. Robert Downey Jr. walked off set after our heated discussion, and I want to take a moment to address that." The audience leaned in, sensing that something real was about to unfold. Colbert looked directly into the camera, his usual joviality replaced by a rare sincerity. "Look, I respect Robert, and I respect anyone who stands up for themselves. Maybe I pushed too hard. Maybe I didn't give him the space he deserved. We all make mistakes. But I also want to say that Robert is a true talent, someone who's been through hell and back to get where he is, and for that, he deserves our respect." It was a humble response, but one that didn't quite erase the tension that had built up between the two men. Still, the shift in Colbert's tone was noticeable. He had chosen to acknowledge the gravity of the situation, even if it wasn't a complete apology. And in that moment, the audience realized that this confrontation wasn't just about two celebrities. It was about navigating the fine line between comedy and respect, in a culture that often blurred those boundaries. The aftermath of the confrontation between Robert Downey Jr. and Stephen Colbert had already begun to take on a life of its own. The media was saturated with coverage, and the public was divided. For some, Downey's walkout had become a moment of empowerment, a display of refusing to be pushed around anymore. For others, Colbert's calm response was a sign of maturity, a reflection of his willingness to take responsibility for the escalating tension on his show. But no matter the side people chose, it was clear that the argument between the two had become symbolic of something larger, something that couldn't easily be explained in a single soundbite. For Colbert, the media storm had only intensified after his on-air acknowledgement of the incident. His ratings had surged, but so had the scrutiny. It wasn't just Downey's fans who were weighing in. Everyone from fellow comedians to political pundits were now adding their voices to the discussion. Was Colbert wrong for pushing Downey too far? Was Downey's reaction an overreaction? The questions didn't stop, and neither did the chatter. Yet in the midst of all the noise, Downey seemed oddly calm. He was back at work focusing on his latest projects, but he wasn't unaware of the continuing buzz around his walkout. He had known that this moment would change the way the world saw him, but he was also prepared for it. He had lived his life in the spotlight for decades, enduring everything from personal battles to public judgment. Now he was at a crossroads. Could he move forward without allowing this incident to define him? Could he embrace the consequences of his actions while still staying true to who he was? In the days following the public response, Downey was approached by various media outlets, all eager to hear his side of the story. The tension surrounding the incident had led to speculation that this was just the beginning of a bitter feud between the two. But when Downey sat down for an exclusive interview, he made it clear that the situation wasn't nearly as simple as the media made it out to be. "I didn't walk out because I wanted to make a statement," Downey explained, his voice steady but earnest. "I did it because I was pushed. And sometimes, when you're pushed to a certain point, you have to push back. It's not about ego or pride, it's about respect." He paused for a moment, reflecting on his words. "I'm not perfect, but I'm tired of pretending to be. The world wants us to be these larger-than-life figures, always on, always performing. But that's not who I am. I'm just a guy who's been through a lot, and at the end of the day, I want people to see me for who I really am." Downey's words resonated with many who had grown tired of the constant spectacle surrounding Hollywood. In an industry that often valued image over substance, his decision to walk off that set felt like a rebellion against the very thing that had made him a star. He wasn't going to let the expectations of others control his narrative any longer. For Colbert, he took a different approach. After the dust settled, he released a heartfelt video message to his audience. While he didn't apologize outright, he did acknowledge the importance of the conversation that had unfolded between him and Downey. "I've spent my career making people laugh, but last night I learned a valuable lesson," Colbert said, his usual comedic tone softened by sincerity. "Humor can only go so far, and at times it's necessary to take a step back and recognize when the boundaries have been crossed." While Colbert's message was undoubtedly sincere, it wasn't without its critics. Some felt he was simply trying to salvage his image after the backlash, while others believed it was a genuine attempt to address the issue at hand. Regardless, the message was clear. The lines between comedy and respect were not as easily defined as they once seemed. As the weeks passed, both Colbert and Downey continued to navigate the aftermath of the confrontation. Colbert returned to his usual late-night routine, though with a noticeably more cautious approach. Downey, on the other hand, remained focused on his career, but he had gained something more valuable from the entire ordeal: a renewed sense of self-awareness. He had taken a stand, and in doing so, he had shown the world that he was no longer willing to be defined by anyone but himself. In the end, the fallout from the explosive argument between Robert Downey Jr. and Stephen Colbert left a lasting mark on both men. For Downey, it was a moment of personal empowerment, a realization that his worth was not determined by the approval of others. For Colbert, it was a humbling reminder of the power dynamics at play and the responsibility he carried as a comedian in a world that often blurred the lines between comedy and real-life consequences. The incident had sparked a conversation that would linger long after the cameras stopped rolling. It wasn't just about two celebrities having a public disagreement. It was about the very nature of fame, the expectations placed on public figures, and the costs that came with it. In the end, one question remained. In a world that demanded constant performance, could these two men ever truly escape the roles they had been cast in? Only time would tell, but what was certain was that they had each learned something valuable about themselves and about the world that watched them.